The house sat at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by tall trees and a neatly cut lawn that the homeowner worked hard to maintain. It wasn't the biggest house in the neighborhood, but it was well cared for, and it felt like a safe place. The homeowner had chosen this spot for the peace it brought, away from busy roads and noise. But peace in a neighborhood sometimes depends on more than trees and fences. It also depends on the people who live around you, and in this case it depended a lot on the HOA. The HOA was always watching. They sent letters if a trash bin stayed out too long. They complained if the grass wasn't trimmed the exact way they liked. Once the homeowner had received a written warning because the front door color was too bold, even though the shade was only slightly darker than the approved list. Living under an HOA sometimes felt less like being part of a community, and more like being under constant inspection. Still, the homeowner followed the rules because that's what you had to do. That didn't mean it was fair. It just meant it was easier to go along than to fight. It was during one of those long summer afternoons that the issue began. A neighbor came by full of energy and excitement. She was planning a birthday party for her daughter, something big and loud with more guests than her own driveway or side of the street could handle. She explained that cars would be lined up, and she casually mentioned how perfect the open stretch of land next door would be for extra parking. That land wasn't empty. It belonged to the homeowner. It was a strip of grass near the driveway, a part of the property that was private and personal. The neighbor asked if her guests could use it. The homeowner didn't need to think long. The answer was polite but firm. "No, sorry, that's my property." It wasn't said with anger, only with boundaries. The land was part of the home, and it wasn't meant for 50 cars to come rolling in and tearing up the grass. The neighbor smiled in a way that didn't seem genuine, nodded quickly and walked away. That should have been the end of it. But the HOA had other plans. A few days later, a notice arrived. It wasn't about grass length or trash bins this time. It was about community cooperation. The HOA had decided that the neighbor could, in fact, use that land for her party parking. They worded it in a way that made it sound like a shared community benefit, but it was written clear enough to understand. They were telling the homeowner that private land would be treated as public, just for the convenience of one neighbor's celebration. It was shocking. The homeowner read the letter 3 times, feeling each word sink deeper. How could they decide this? How could they take something private and pretend it was theirs to give away? The unfairness hit hard, like a weight pressing down. Memories of all the small, strict warnings from the HOA flashed through the mind. Warnings for things that didn't matter, for rules that seemed silly. And now suddenly those same rule enforcers were willing to bend everything just to please one neighbor. It felt like a betrayal. The frustration didn't fade. Instead, it grew stronger each day leading up to the party. The homeowner walked outside and imagined cars lined up on the grass, engines dripping oil, tires pressing down until the ground was ruined. This wasn't just about inconvenience. It was about respect, or the lack of it. The HOA wasn't respecting the boundaries of property, and the neighbor wasn't respecting a clear no. At night, sitting by the window, the homeowner thought about what might happen. Would guests laugh as they parked? Would they even realize they were on someone else's land? Maybe they would think it was just extra space open for anyone. That thought stung. Private property was supposed to mean something. Ownership was supposed to come with rights. Yet here it seemed like those rights didn't matter if the HOA decided otherwise. Still, nothing could be done before the party. Complaints had already been ignored. The HOA had made up its mind. All the homeowner could do was prepare. And so the waiting began. The days ticked by slowly, each one filled with a growing sense of dread and annoyance. The more the event approached, the more the homeowner realized this wasn't just about parking. It was about control. It was about standing up against being pushed around. On the morning before the party, the homeowner mowed the lawn carefully, not because it mattered to the HOA, but because it mattered to them. It was their land, their space, and they wanted it cared for. The lines of freshly cut grass were straight, the edges trimmed. It looked perfect, even though deep down there was the sinking knowledge that by tomorrow it wouldn't look the same. Tomorrow that neat green stretch would become a parking lot. The thought twisted in the stomach, turning into a mix of anger and resolve. There was no loud confrontation, not yet. Just quiet preparation, watching and waiting. The house stood ready, and the homeowner stood ready too, knowing the next day would test patience, strength, and maybe even creativity. The HOA had made their decision. The neighbor had made hers. But the homeowner wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The morning of the party arrived, and the neighborhood looked different. There was a sense of movement and noise even before the guests came. The neighbor's house had colorful balloons tied to the mailbox, and music could already be heard drifting faintly across the street. The homeowner stepped outside and looked at their own lawn, freshly cut just the day before, still green and neat. A heavy feeling sat in the chest, knowing what was about to happen. At first, it started slowly. 1 or 2 cars pulled into the street, people stepping out with wrapped gifts in bright paper. The cars parked along the curb, and the homeowner thought maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't get too bad. But then another car came, then another. And soon it was like a line stretching down the road. The sound of engines filled the once quiet street, and doors slammed one after the other. The homeowner watched from the front porch as the first car boldly pulled into their grass. The tires left a mark, just a faint one, but enough to show the ground had been pressed. The driver didn't even look toward the house. They got out, fixed their shirt, and walked off toward the party like nothing was wrong. It stung. That land had always been private, personal, and now strangers acted like it was theirs. 1 car became 2, and soon the yard was filling up like a makeshift parking lot. Guests didn't hesitate. Some drove onto the lawn without thinking twice. The grass flattened under their wheels, the neat lines from mowing disappeared, and the sound of crunching gravel near the driveway made the homeowner's jaw tighten. People laughed as they got out carrying bags and balloons, not even glancing back at the property they had just driven over. The homeowner walked a few steps forward, trying to catch someone's eye, but no one looked. They were too busy greeting each other, too focused on the party ahead. It felt like being invisible on your own land. The frustration grew with every car that rolled in. The space filled faster than expected. By the time 20 cars were parked, the lawn already looked different. Patches of green were gone, replaced by lines of dirt where tires had pressed deep. The neighbor, busy greeting her guests, caught sight of the homeowner standing there. Instead of looking guilty or apologetic, she waved with a wide smile as if this was all perfectly fine. That smile made the anger worse. It wasn't kindness, it was arrogance, the kind of smile that said, "This is happening whether you like it or not." By midday, more than 40 cars had crammed into the yard and driveway edges. Some even blocked part of the homeowner's garage, making it impossible to get out if they wanted to. The driveway wasn't just theirs anymore. It had been taken over by people who didn't even live there. Children ran across the yard, weaving between the cars, and laughter carried across the grass. But it wasn't joyful for the homeowner. It was a sharp reminder of how little their voice had mattered. Standing at the edge of the porch, the homeowner tried to take a deep breath, but it only filled them with more unease. Every new arrival seemed like another slap in the face. The HOA had sided with the neighbor, and now here it was. The proof of how powerless that decision had made them feel. Each guest walked past as if the house and its owner didn't even exist. Some even tossed empty cups or snack wrappers near the yard, not caring where they landed. Inside, the homeowner paced back and forth, trying to calm down. Anger burned hot, but underneath it was something colder: determination. There had to be a way to take back control, a way to show that this wasn't okay. Watching the line of expensive cars outside sparked a thought. These weren't just regular cars. Some of them gleamed in the sunlight, polished and spotless. The kind of vehicles that clearly belonged to people who cared about appearances, people who wouldn't want scratches or tickets or anything that made them look careless. The idea was small at first, just a flicker. But the longer the homeowner watched, the brighter it became. If the HOA said the land could be used, then maybe it could be used in a way no one expected. If people wanted to park there, maybe it was time to make them pay for it. The neighbor and the HOA had treated the land like public space. Well, public space came with rules, and sometimes public space came with a price. The homeowner sat down at the kitchen table, grabbed a piece of paper, and began to write. The words came fast. Private parking auction, highest bid wins spot. The letters were big and bold, written in thick black marker so no one could miss them. It wasn't elegant, but it was clear. They taped the sign to a piece of cardboard and carried it outside, setting it near the driveway entrance where everyone could see. Guests noticed right away. Some laughed, thinking it was a joke. Others frowned, confused. A man walking toward the house stopped, read the sign twice, then asked, "Is this real?" The homeowner didn't smile. "Yes, real. You're on private property. If you want to stay here, you bid. If not, you move your car." At first, people muttered and rolled their eyes, but soon whispers started spreading. A few guests clearly didn't want trouble, especially with their expensive cars. They came back quietly, pulling out wallets, asking how much it would take to keep their spot. The homeowner stayed calm, naming numbers. The first person paid without arguing. Then another. Slowly, what started as confusion turned into something else entirely. A competition. Someone offered more, wanting a better space closer to the party. Another person, overhearing, pulled out cash and topped the bid. Within minutes, it wasn't just about parking. It was about pride, about winning. Guests began bidding against each other, waving bills, demanding to secure their spot. The homeowner didn't raise their voice. They simply nodded, collected the money, and handed out slips of paper with "paid" written on them. The slips weren't fancy, but they worked. Anyone without one risked being told to leave. From the porch, the neighbor noticed what was happening. Her happy expression faded quickly. She marched over, furious, demanding to know what the homeowner was doing. "You can't do this," she said, her voice sharp. But the homeowner stood tall, calm, and firm. "The HOA said my land could be used. I'm using it. And if your guests want it, they're paying for it," the neighbor argued. But guests were already handing over money, too worried about losing their spots to care what she thought. Some even defended the homeowner, saying it was fair. After all, parking this close was worth something. The neighbor's face grew red with frustration, but she couldn't stop it. The control she thought she had slipped away, replaced by the homeowner's quiet authority. By the time the bidding slowed, the homeowner had a small pile of cash tucked safely inside. It wasn't just about the money, though, that felt satisfying. It was about the principle. For once, the balance of power had shifted. The people who had ignored the no now had to listen. The guests who had walked across the grass without care now treated it with caution, afraid of losing what they had paid for. As the party continued in full swing, music and laughter spilling across the street, the homeowner sat back on the porch watching. The lawn was still filled with cars, but this time it didn't sting as much. Every vehicle there was a reminder that they hadn't been powerless. They had found a way to take back control, to show that their land wasn't just free space for others to use. And deep down, the homeowner knew this was only the beginning. The neighbor was angry. The HOA would hear about this, and the story wasn't over yet. The sun was high, and the party across the street was now in full swing. Music boomed louder, and laughter carried through the warm afternoon air. Children ran across the neighbor's yard with balloons in their hands, while clusters of adults stood around sipping drinks and chatting. From the outside, it looked like the perfect summer gathering. But for the homeowner, sitting calmly on the porch, the scene was not as cheerful. The yard, once green and neatly trimmed, was lined with cars of all shapes and sizes. The auction sign still stood near the driveway. And every now and then, another guest would approach, looking uncomfortable but willing to pay for peace of mind. The homeowner had not expected it to work so well. The first few bids had been hesitant, almost awkward. But once people realized that this was serious, the money began flowing. It wasn't about greed. It was about fairness, about taking back control of a situation that had been forced upon them. If the HOA wanted to call the property community space, then the homeowner would treat it like a business opportunity. A small smirk played at the corner of their lips as they counted the bills again, folding them neatly and slipping them into a metal tin they had pulled from the kitchen. It wasn't just about collecting money. It was the shift in energy. Before, the guest had acted as if the yard was theirs to use freely. Now they approached with caution, their voices low, their faces tense. Some even apologized as they paid, clearly embarrassed by the whole situation. A man in a shiny car had offered double just to keep his spot, nervous that his vehicle might be asked to move. Another woman, carrying a gift bag and looking flustered, handed over cash while muttering under her breath that she wasn't told about this. The homeowners stayed calm and polite, never raising their voice, never showing anger. It was business, plain and simple. The neighbor, however, was furious. She stormed over again, her arms crossed tight against her chest, her face red from both the sun and frustration. "You can't do this," she hissed. "This is ridiculous. They're my guests, and this is a party. You're ruining it." The homeowner met her eyes steadily. "My land, my rules. The HOA said it could be used, so I'm using it. If your guests want to stay, they pay. If not, they can move their cars to the public street. Simple. The neighbor's mouth opened as if to argue again, but the sight of one of her guests handing over another $20 bill silenced her. She spun on her heel and walked back to her house, her steps stiff with anger. The homeowner leaned back in the porch chair, feeling a quiet satisfaction. For once, they weren't the one being pushed around. The auction continued in waves. Every time a new car tried to squeeze in, someone would point them toward the sign. Some complained, but others just handed over the cash without arguing. The homeowner kept track with little slips of paper, each one marked paid. Soon the lawn looked more organized, with the paid cars placed in neat rows, almost like a real parking lot. People who hadn't paid were quick to notice the difference and hurried back to settle their own fees, afraid they might be forced out. What had begun as an invasion was now something entirely different. It had become a system, one that the homeowner controlled. Guests who had once ignored the property owner now spoke to them respectfully, even cautiously. Some even joked nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Guess you found a way to make some extra money today," one man said with a strained laugh. The homeowner just nodded, not giving away how much satisfaction they felt in turning the tables. Inside the neighbor's yard, though, the mood had shifted. The birthday decorations still fluttered in the breeze and the music played on, but attention lingered. Guests whispered to each other about the unexpected parking auction. Some rolled their eyes, others shook their heads, but none dared defy it. The homeowner could see it written across their faces. They weren't angry at the property owner. They were angry at the neighbor who had promised them easy parking without mentioning the conflict. Some even looked annoyed at her directly, and that only deepened her frustration. As the afternoon dragged on, the homeowner kept watch. They didn't mingle or chat with the partygoers. They stayed on their porch like a quiet guard. Every sound from the neighbor's yard, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the music, was a reminder of how this whole situation had started. It wasn't jealousy or bitterness. It was about principle, about standing firm when someone tried to take advantage. At one point, the HOA board members themselves showed up. Two of them walked over, trying to look official in their pressed clothes and serious expressions. They stopped near the porch, their eyes flicking from the cars to the sign to the stack of payment slips. One of them cleared his throat. "What exactly is going on here?" The homeowner didn't flinch. "I'm managing my property. You told me it could be used, so I set up a fair system. They're parking here and they're paying for it. No problem, right?" The board members exchanged looks. They clearly hadn't expected this outcome. One muttered something about not being what we meant, but the homeowner cut in smoothly. "You made the decision. I'm just following through. This way no one is confused. They know the rules and I get to protect my land." There was silence. The board members didn't like being challenged, but they also couldn't argue without admitting they'd overstepped in the first place. After a few moments, they walked away without another word, heading back to the party with stiff shoulders. The homeowner watched them go, feeling the quiet thrill of victory. For once, the HOA had nothing to hold over them. As evening approached, the party grew louder. Music shifted into faster songs and people clapped along. Lights were strung up, glowing softly as the sun dipped lower. But the parking lot, the homeowner's yard, remained under control. People who had paid checked their cars nervously now and then, making sure everything was fine. A few even nodded politely to the homeowner as they passed, no longer ignoring their presence. The shift was undeniable. Respect had been forced, but it was there. Still, not everything was calm. The neighbor returned one more time, her voice sharp with anger. "You're embarrassing me," she snapped. "This is supposed to be a happy day, and you've turned it into a circus." The homeowner stayed seated, their tone calm but firm. "No, you did that when you ignored my no. I didn't ask for this, but I won't let people walk all over me. If you don't like it, take it up with the HOA." Her eyes narrowed, but she had no reply. She turned and left again, muttering under her breath. The homeowner didn't chase her, didn't argue further. They didn't need to. The point had been made. As night fell and the music began to fade, guests slowly started to leave. One by one, cars pulled out of the yard, their headlights sweeping across the grass. Some drivers waved politely as they left, a few even saying thank you awkwardly as if unsure what else to do. The lawn, once packed tight, slowly emptied. leaving behind flattened grass and muddy tire marks. It wasn't the same as before, but it was theirs again. When the last car finally drove away, the homeowner stepped down from the porch and walked across the yard. The damage was clear, but so was the victory. They knelt down, running a hand across the dirt where the grass had been pressed flat. It would take time to fix, but it could be fixed. What mattered was that they hadn't been silent. They hadn't let the HOA or the neighbor control everything. With the metal tin of cash tucked safely under their arm, the homeowner looked across the street at the neighbor's house. The decorations still hung, but the joy had dimmed. People were cleaning up quietly, their voices lower, their movements slower. The neighbor stood alone near her porch, avoiding eye contact. For once, she wasn't smiling. The homeowner turned back toward their own house, a sense of calm washing over them. This wasn't the end. There would be fallout. The HOA would have meetings, the neighbor would complain, and there would be more arguments ahead. But tonight, standing in the cool evening air, the homeowner felt something rare, satisfaction. For the first time in a long time, they had not been the one to bow down. They had found a way to take control, and that feeling was worth more than anything else. The story wasn't finished, but a chapter had closed. And as the lights across the street flickered off one by one, the homeowner knew that tomorrow would bring new battles. But tonight the win was theirs. The next morning, the neighborhood felt quieter than usual. The music was gone, the balloons had wilted, and the street looked empty compared to the chaos of the day before. But the yard was a different story. The grass was crushed flat in wide streaks. Patches of dirt showed through where tires had pressed too deep, and bits of trash had been left behind. The homeowner stood on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, staring at the damage. The victory from the night before was still fresh, but so was the reminder of what it had cost. It wasn't long before the phone started buzzing. Messages from neighbors, some curious and some nosy, filled the screen. A few had heard about the auction and wanted to know if it was real. Others congratulated the homeowner quietly, saying they admired the way they stood up to the HOA. But not every message was friendly. A few criticized, saying it was petty or childish to charge people. The homeowner ignored those. People who hadn't been in the middle of it couldn't understand what it felt like to be walked over again and again. By late morning, the knock came, sharp, heavy, and demanding. The homeowner opened the door to find the neighbor standing there, her arms crossed tight, her face set in a scowl. She didn't waste time. "You humiliated me yesterday," she snapped. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? My guests are still talking about it. They think I'm some kind of fool for not telling them about your little scheme." The homeowner stayed calm, leaning lightly against the doorframe. "Your guests wouldn't have been embarrassed if you'd respected my no in the first place. This wouldn't have happened if you or the HOA had listened." Her eyes narrowed. "You think this is over? I've already filed a complaint. The HOA is furious. You'll regret this." The homeowner let out a quiet laugh. "The HOA made the decision that allowed it. If they're angry, that's their problem. I followed their rule. They can't punish me for doing exactly what they said." The neighbor's lips pressed into a thin line. She muttered something under her breath and stormed off, slamming her own front door across the street. The homeowner didn't chase after her. They didn't need to. The argument had spoken for itself. Not long after, an email arrived from the HOA. It was written in the same stiff, overly formal tone they always used, full of words like concerns and community, harmony. They claimed they had received multiple complaints about the unauthorized auction event and that it had created disturbance and confusion among residents. But the homeowner noticed something missing. Nowhere in the email did it say they had broken a rule. Nowhere did it say they had violated HOA guidelines. Instead, it danced around the issue, scolding without real authority. The homeowner replied simply, "I used my property as you allowed. Guests parked, I organized it. Damage was done, but I managed the situation. If you want to discuss further, we can do it with a lawyer present." Hitting send felt good. For once, the HOA would be the one scrambling. Over the next few days, tension spread through the neighborhood. People whispered when they passed by. Some avoided eye contact. Others smiled quietly, giving small nods as if to say, "Good for you." The neighbor, though, avoided the homeowner completely. She stayed inside most of the time, and when she did step out, her face was tight with anger. Her perfect birthday party had turned into gossip. and the story was spreading faster than she could control it. The HOA called for a meeting that weekend. It was held in the small community center, a place with beige walls and rows of folding chairs. The homeowner walked in, head held high, and could feel the eyes on them. Some were supportive, some disapproving, but everyone was curious. The board members sat at a long table in the front, looking serious and stiff. One of them cleared his throat and began. "We are here to discuss the recent incident regarding property use and community disruption. While parking is often a challenge during large gatherings, the method employed to handle the situation, specifically the charging of fees and an auction system, was highly unusual and caused distress to several residents." The homeowner raised a hand calmly. "May I respond?" The board hesitated, then nodded. "I said no when asked to use my property. The neighbor ignored it, and the board overruled me. You forced me into a situation where 57 cars were parked on my land without consent. I could have called the police for trespassing, but instead I organized it. I made sure it was orderly. And if you're upset about the money, let me remind you, I didn't invite those cars. I managed them. If people were distressed, it's because they realized the HOA had no right to force private property into community use." The room grew quiet. A few people even nodded in agreement. The board shuffled their papers, clearly uncomfortable. Another member spoke. "Still, the auction aspect was unnecessary." The homeowner leaned forward slightly. "Unnecessary? Maybe effective? Absolutely. My land was protected, damage still happened, and I will be sending a bill for repairs. But what's unnecessary is an HOA that thinks it can decide my property is a public parking lot. That's not your right. And if it happens again, I won't be so accommodating." The silence stretched long. Finally, the board moved on to other topics, clearly unwilling to press further. The homeowner knew then that the point had landed. They couldn't admit fault outright, but they also couldn't punish someone for standing up for themselves. Leaving the meeting, a few neighbors stopped the homeowner quietly. One whispered, "Good for you." About time someone stood up to them. Another muttered, "I wish I'd thought of that years ago." It wasn't open support, but it was enough to show the tide was shifting. Back at home, the yard still looked scarred. The homeowner hired a landscaping crew with part of the auction money. Watching the workers reseed the lawn, lay down new soil, and carefully restore what had been damaged felt like reclaiming more than just grass. It was reclaiming dignity. Every shovel of dirt was proof that they had turned the tables, that what was meant to be a loss had become a win. The neighbor, of course, still fumed. Rumors said she had complained to anyone who would listen, spinning the story to make herself the victim. But the more she spoke, the less sympathy she received. People knew the truth. They had seen the cars, heard the music, watched the chaos, and many admired the homeowner for handling it in a way no one expected. Weeks passed, and the whispers faded into neighborhood history. The HOA never brought up the subject again, at least not officially. They had learned their lesson. The homeowner kept the payment slips as a quiet reminder, tucked away in a drawer. Every time they opened it, the sight of those little pieces of paper brought a smile. Not because of the money, but because of what it represented. A moment when they had refused to be powerless. One evening, sitting on the porch with the sun setting behind the trees, the homeowner thought back to that first knock on the door. When the neighbor had asked to use the yard, it seemed so small now, that single request. But it had turned into something bigger, a test of boundaries, respect, and fairness. And in the end, they had passed the test. The grass would grow back. The whispers would fade. But the memory of that day, of finding strength in the middle of frustration, would remain. And if the HOA or anyone else ever tried something like that again, the homeowner knew one thing for sure. They wouldn't hesitate to stand their ground. They had already proven they could. The weeks after the party settled into a new rhythm. The yard, once torn up and scarred, began to heal under the careful work of the landscaping crew. Fresh grass sprouted where the soil had been reseeded, and the sound of sprinklers at dawn filled the quiet mornings. The homeowner would sometimes sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the new green spread across the land, knowing it had cost money, time, and effort, but also knowing it had been worth it. Every new blade of grass felt like a victory. The auction money had covered the repairs and more. What was left was put aside, saved for future projects, maybe even improvements around the house. But it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about what it symbolized. It was about proving that one voice, even when ignored, could still find a way to be heard. The HOA remained strangely quiet. No more threatening letters came. No more warnings about small details. It was as if the board had learned that pushing too hard could backfire. The homeowner knew they hadn't changed overnight. They were still the same group who cared more about appearances than fairness. But for now, they were keeping their distance. That in itself was a win. The neighbor across the street, however, hadn't moved on. She avoided eye contact, but her bitterness showed in other ways. She stopped waving at anyone who walked by. Her yard wasn't as neatly kept as before, and sometimes guests who visited her left quickly, glancing awkwardly toward the homeowner's house as if they didn't want to be caught talking. She had lost more than just a parking battle. She had lost face, and in a neighborhood like this, reputation carried weight. One afternoon, while watering the new grass, the homeowner noticed a car slow down near the curb. A man leaned out the window and called, "Hey, you're the one who did that parking thing, right?" The homeowner nodded cautiously. The man smiled. "Brilliant move. I wish I'd thought of that when the board tried to fine me for having too many guests last year. Good for you." It wasn't the first time someone had said something like that. Quiet compliments came from unexpected places. A woman at the grocery store, another neighbor out walking her dog. Word had traveled farther than expected. People admired the courage it took to stand up, even in such an unusual way. Each kind word was another reminder that sometimes one person's stand could inspire others. Still, life wasn't perfect. The yard might heal, but memories of that day were still fresh. There were moments when the homeowner would look at the driveway and picture the line of cars, the noise, the disrespect. But then they would remember the signs, the slips of paper marked "paid," the quiet way the balance had shifted. And the memory would bring a smile instead of anger. A few weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail, but this one was different. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from a local lawyer offering services and mentioning that several residents were thinking of challenging the HOA's overreach. The letter hinted that the parking auction incident had sparked something bigger. People were realizing they didn't always have to accept unfair rules. The homeowner tucked the letter into a drawer. They weren't ready to dive into legal battles yet, but it felt good to know change was brewing. Life slowly returned to normal. The homeowner worked in the garden, waved at friendly neighbors, and enjoyed the small victories of each day. But the experience had left a mark. They were no longer the quiet, rule-following resident who accepted every letter and warning without question. They had found their voice, and once found, it couldn't be silenced. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, the homeowner sat on the porch thinking back over everything. The first request from the neighbor, the arrogant smile, the heavy feeling of helplessness when the HOA sided against them, all of it had led to that one moment of choice. To either let it happen or take action, and taking action had changed everything. The neighbor's party had been meant to push boundaries, to take advantage of kindness and silence. Instead, it had turned into a lesson for the neighbor, for the HOA, and maybe even for the entire community. Boundaries mattered. Respect mattered. And when those were ignored, there could be consequences. The homeowner stood stretched and walked across the lawn. The grass was soft underfoot, new and fresh, as if the ground itself had decided to start over. They knelt down, pressing a hand against the soil, feeling the strength of what had been rebuilt. It was more than just land. It was a symbol of standing tall, of refusing to be trampled on. Across the street, the neighbor's house sat quiet. No music, no balloons, no guests filling the driveway. Just silence. The homeowner didn't feel anger anymore. Instead, there was a calm sense of closure. People who tried to take without respect eventually faced the truth. And in this case, the truth had been made clear. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, the homeowner returned to the porch, a soft smile on their face. They had learned something important, not just about neighbors or HOAs, but about themselves. That no matter how small one voice might seem, it could still make a difference. That no matter how many people tried to push you down, there was always a way to rise. The story wasn't just about cars or grass or money. It was about respect, about standing up when no one else would. And as the night settled in, the homeowner knew one thing for certain. If it ever happened again, they would be ready. Stronger, calmer, and unafraid. Because once you've stood your ground, once you've turned a moment of helplessness into a moment of power, You never forget how it feels. And that feeling, the quiet strength of knowing you refuse to be walked over, was something no HOA, no neighbor, and no crowd of party guests could ever take away again. Months had passed since the infamous birthday party incident, but the story still lived quietly in the neighborhood. For most people, it had become a tale to share over coffee or during casual chats at the mailbox. Yet for the homeowner, the memory remained more personal, something that had shaped the way they looked at their surroundings and the people who lived nearby. The yard was now in perfect shape, even better than before. The landscaping crew had not only repaired the damage but also added small improvements. A row of fresh shrubs along the edge, a new flower bed that bloomed in bright colors, and a sturdier gravel edge near the driveway to prevent future tire marks. Every detail felt like a reminder that sometimes things had to break before they could be rebuilt stronger. But the peace did not last forever. One morning, a notice appeared on the homeowner's mailbox. It was from the HOA, stamped with their familiar logo. The letter spoke of a new proposal: shared neighborhood events that would use communal resources and neighbor contributions to foster togetherness. On the surface, it sounded harmless, but tucked in the middle was a troubling sentence. It mentioned the possibility of temporary use of private property with community oversight. The homeowner read the line twice, their stomach tightening. It was vague enough to be slippery, but clear enough to raise alarm. It was as if the HOA hadn't learned its lesson, only softened its language. They were still pushing the idea that individual property could be treated as community space whenever it suited them. Later that day, while out trimming the new shrubs, a neighbor approached quietly. He was older, his hands tucked in his pockets and his voice low. "Got the letter?" he asked. The homeowner nodded. "I did. Looks like they're trying again." The man frowned. "That's what I thought too. A few of us are worried. We remember what happened at that party. If they get this through, it won't stop there." The homeowner agreed. The party incident had shown what could happen when rules weren't clear. And now, with this proposal, it felt like the HOA was opening the door for more problems. That weekend, another meeting was scheduled at the community center. This time, the room was more crowded than before. Word had spread about the new proposal, and many residents were uneasy. Some were worried about their driveways, others about their backyards, and a few about noise and damage. The homeowner sat quietly at first, listening as the board presented their plan with polished smiles. "It's about unity," one board member said brightly. "It's about building stronger connections, and sometimes that means sharing space. What better way to celebrate as neighbors than to open our doors and yards for everyone?" A murmur ran through the crowd. It sounded good, but everyone knew there was more at stake. The homeowner finally raised a hand. "With respect," they began, their voice steady but firm. "We all know what this really means. I've lived here long enough to see how rules are used. Last time you told me my land could be used without my consent. 57 cars parked in my yard, and I was left to clean up the mess. I managed it, but it wasn't fair. And now you want to make it official that the HOA can decide when our private property is suddenly public space? That's not unity. That's overreach." The room grew quiet. People shifted in their chairs, nodding slightly. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Another resident spoke up. "I agree. I don't want people using my driveway because the HOA says so. That's not why I bought this house." Soon voices rose across the room. Some defended the HOA, saying it was for the greater good. Others, however, were firm in their opposition. The homeowner listened, adding their thoughts when needed, but mostly letting the tide of frustration flow. It became clear that many felt the same way. They were tired of decisions being made without respect for individual rights. By the end of the meeting, the board looked rattled. They promised to reconsider the wording and take feedback seriously, but the homeowner knew the fight wasn't over. It was only the beginning of a larger struggle. In the days that followed, small groups of neighbors began meeting informally. They gathered in living rooms, on porches, even near the community pool. The conversations were always the same: how to push back, how to hold the board accountable, how to make sure private property stayed private. The homeowner often joined these talks, sharing their own experience as proof of what could happen. It wasn't long before an idea formed: a petition. Simple, clear, and strong. The message was straightforward: No HOA policy should ever allow private property to be used without explicit consent. The homeowner helped draft it, their words plain but powerful. And soon signatures began to fill the pages. People signed eagerly. Some told stories of their own frustrations, fines for small things, warnings for harmless decorations, notices that felt more like threats. Others admitted they had always been too afraid to speak up, but now, after seeing what had happened with the party, they felt braver. The petition gave them a voice. One evening, as the homeowner collected the last few signatures, they realized something had shifted in the community. People were no longer whispering their complaints in private. They were standing together out in the open. What had started as one person's problem had become everyone's cause. When the next HOA meeting arrived, the petition was presented. The homeowner stood in front of the board, holding the thick stack of signatures. Their voice was calm but firm. These are the voices of this community. We are not against unity, and we are not against gatherings. But respect must come first. No one should feel like their home can be taken over because of vague rules. This is our line, and we will not move it. The board members looked down at the papers, the weight of the community's voices too heavy to ignore. They tried to argue, tried to explain, but the crowd was louder this time, more united. People clapped, spoke up, and refused to be silenced. The board had no choice but to back down. The proposal was withdrawn. That night, as the meeting ended, a sense of relief filled the air. Neighbors shook hands, exchanged smiles, and for once the community felt truly connected, not because of the HOA, but because they had stood together. The homeowner walked home slowly, the cool night breeze carrying the sound of quiet laughter and conversation. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood didn't feel divided. It felt alive. Back at home, the homeowner sat on the porch, looking out over the yard. The grass was thick and healthy now, glowing softly under the porch light. They thought about the journey, the frustration, the fight, the unexpected victory. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Across the street, the neighbor's house was dark. The woman who had once pushed so hard for her party still avoided the homeowner. Perhaps she was embarrassed, perhaps still angry. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the balance had shifted, not just for one yard, but for the entire neighborhood. The homeowner leaned back, feeling a calm satisfaction. They knew challenges would come again. That was the nature of living in a place with rules and boards and personalities. But now they also knew something else. They weren't alone. And with that knowledge, the future felt a little less heavy. As the stars filled the night sky, the homeowner smiled. What had started as a fight over a birthday party had become a turning point. It had taught them and their neighbors that respect mattered more than rules, and that when people stood together, even the loudest voices of authority had to listen. And so, with the quiet hum of crickets in the background and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, life moved forward. Not perfect, not without challenges, but stronger, fairer, and brighter than before.